so I'm going to start out with a Bible verse from Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect. Okay, who was Edward Lee Thorndike? He was born August 31st in Williamsburg, Massachusetts. Like I said, he was the second of 4 children, and all of them had important scientific careers. His mother was a housewife, and his father was a Methodist minister. He was strongly motivated to succeed, found schoolwork easy, and was a brilliant student. He was really shy and often lonely, and he was very self-conscious about being a minister's kid. Thorndike graduated in 1891, having ranked first or second in all of his high school classes. Where did Edward get his education? In 1891, he entered Wesleyan University, a school founded by the Methodist Church. Edward was had a brilliant academic record there, and each year won at least one major academic prize. Thorndike, after that, entered Harvard University, where he planned to study English, philosophy, and psychology. What or who inspired Edward? While he was at Wesleyan, he was required to take psychology in order to win one of his prizes, and he said that it was dull and he didn't like it very much. But he had to read a book by James called The Principles of Psychology, and he stated that it was the most stimulating book he had ever read, and it was one of the only psychology books that he had ever read. When Edward went to Harvard, James influence strengthened his interest in psychology. In 1896, he began his first independent research, which was inspired in James' belief that in mind reading demonstrations, the person whose mind is being read may consciously make subtle facial movements that provide cues for the mind reader. While he was at Harvard, he actually did an experiment with kids and to see if they could read facial cues better than adults, and the school actually told him he couldn't do it anymore. So he had a switch, which comes into the next slide. Then he started experimenting on chickens. Edward conducted an experiment on chickens to test the learning capacity of chickens or animals in general. Using stacked books as walls, Edward built a number of pens for the chickens. He ran an experiment in which a chicken had to find its way out of the pen to a surrounding enclosure containing food, water, and other chickens. First, the chicken would run up and down, peeping loudly and showing a lot of distress. But after many unsuccessful attempts, the chicken would finally find the exit and leave the pen. When a chicken was repeatedly placed in the pen, it ran to the exit more and more often. Edward found that the chickens had learned to escape from the pen. He actually stated that he didn't have any interest in animals, and he didn't really want to experiment on animals, but he did it so that he could get his degree. And his interest in the chickens came from a Harvard professor, C. Lloyd Morgan. What is the law of effect? One of his most famous experiments was done with cats, and kind of the same situation with the chickens, except this was like the cats had to like push a pedal or pull a string or something. But just like the kitten experiment or the chicken experiment, the kittens were put in a puzzle box and were required to learn to escape and obtain food by making specific response. When first placed in these boxes, just like the chickens, the cats showed a great deal of distress, and they hit or miss. They usually were scratching and clawing and weren't really paying any attention until they accidentally made a response which opened the door to the food. With training, the amount of trial and error behavior decreased, so eventually the cats could escape from the boxes quickly and smoothly. Edward considered the learning he had observed to be governed by what he called the law of effect. And the law of effect. He saw the problem box as a stimulus situation in which a hungry cat makes a variety of responses. Most of the responses resulted in annoyers, that is, failures to escape from the box and gain food. So the association or connection between those responses and the stimuli situation weakens. A much smaller number of responses led to satisfiers, that is, escape from the box and access food. So the connection between those responses and stimuli situation strengthens. And according to Thorndike, satisfiers and annoyers act selectively and stamp in certain stimuli responses connection to weaken others. Response that produce satisfiers that their connection to the stimuli glued more strongly than did responses that produce annoyers, which have their connection weakened. What did Edward do after his experiments? He received his PhD after the chicken and the cat experiments, and the only position he could find was at the College of Women of Western Reserve University in Cleveland. And after he left there, he actually was a professor of a subject he really didn't know anything about, and so it said that while he was learning, he was learning while having to teach the kids. And he was only like a few steps ahead of the kids the entire time. But after that, he took a job at the Teachers College at Columbia. During his time at Teachers College, he averaged 10 publications a year. Many of these publications were major works. Despite his extensive and successful experiments, Edward devoted his time to education, which I said earlier, which is said to have stemmed from his academic childhood household. He devoted his time to developing techniques that would allow the measurement of individual differences, creating the CABD test in students. Edward believed that genetic factors are of primary importance, and the systematic eugenics is the only hope for human population.
Keeps coming up.
What is Edward's applied research? At his time at Teachers College, he worked on a number of industrial problems. He developed an employee examination for applicants for the position with the American Tobacco Company and selection tests for clerical workers. During World War II, he did most of this statistical analysis for the Army testing projects and worked on the development of selection techniques for aviators. With support from the Carnegie Corporation, Edward undertook to survey the quality of life in American cities. His results were published in New York City. He assembled a multitude of health facts about each city. A second line investigations were inspired when one of Edward's children found it difficult to spell. He then took it upon himself to write a junior dictionary for children because I guess the dictionaries were using more difficult words to explain a word than it was necessary. So he made two dictionaries, the junior dictionary and the Thorndike Senior Century Dictionary, which is for young adults. His major contributions were his two experiments on chickens and kittens, and he also had hundreds of publications, but his major publication was Educational Psychology. He developed the CABD test to measure students' skill and abilities. His work on applied research and publications of dictionaries. And that's it.